All right. So in today's episode, we have my friend Tim, who has just been at my place for a few hours having hot pot. Yay! Could you introduce yourself and let us know what you're doing out here in Mexico and all that?
With pleasure. My name is Tim. I've been living in Mexico for about a year and a half now. I spent most of the time before that living in the U.S. in a small state called Maryland, very close to Washington, D.C. I'm a math teacher, English teacher, and technically now I'm also a physics teacher, but my fortes, you could say, are English and math.
I do remember that you said you were a physics teacher because I was like, damn. How did you get out here? How did you find yourself in Querétaro?
I was looking for a job somewhere in Latin America because I already spoke Spanish more or less before I came here, and so I was looking for a place where I could, speak the language. And I had heard some good things about Mexico from friends who are from here and who have lived and worked here. And I have a friend who actually is an ex-student at the school that I teach at now. So I reached out to him and I was like, hey, you have any contacts you could, help me out with? And he was like, yeah, at my old school. And I'm like, okay, cool. And yeah, I emailed them and they were looking for exactly the type of teacher that I am. So as I mentioned, I teach math. I taught math in the States. I've taught English before, and technically I'm certified to teach science as well. They were looking for a teacher to teach English, math, and physics in English. And so I was like, okay, yeah. And I had never heard of Querétaro before, coming here. And they were like, we have a job for you in Querétaro. I was like, I don't know where that is, but okay, let's do it.
And then we got to meet you here in all of the dinners and then the little get-togethers. What were your first impressions of Mexico when you arrived, and how long did it take you to feel super comfortable, if you are already quite comfortable?
My first impression of Mexico, and then how long did it take me to get comfortable? I think so. My first impression of Mexico was a pretty cool one because my first time in Mexico was right after the pandemic, so we had been at home for months, and wasn't going anywhere, and so I was dating a Mexican girl at the time.
Okay.
And so I wanted to go see her, and I was also at home in quarantine, and I ended up, as soon as I got vaccinated, I took the first plane I could get, or the first chance I could get to come out to Mexico. And I remember being on that plane and feeling that feeling of you're going to a different country, and on top of that, I was going to see my girlfriend. That was exciting. So I remember that feeling a lot. And then when I touched down, you immediately feel it's different. I had never been to a country in Latin America before, and it's coming from the U.S. It's just a very different vibe, And then just being surrounded by Spanish and seeing different types of food, and even just seeing the little things just the designs of signs or the way that the roads look. It was just new, exciting for me. So I really enjoyed it. And the more that I've been here in Mexico, the more I just, I would say fall in love. I really love Mexico. I've really come to a point where I really love being here. And yeah, so my first impression was a great one. But the more I'm here, the more I get to actually know it. And I think that the more I get to know it, the more I actually appreciate it. As opposed to the first time was just exciting, new, and fun, which was also great. But, now it's, and I've been here a year and a half, so I haven't been here for 10 years, but, I feel like the depth of my experience is a lot more profound now. And how long did it take me to get used to? So, as I mentioned, I was dating a Mexican girl, so I feel like I kind of had an intro course into Mexican culture already, so that helped. And then Yeah, I would say within probably the first like 6 months, I would say I felt pretty good. You know, I think there was a little bit of a in the beginning. I think the main thing was language. Like I spoke Spanish, and I would, you know, I understood most things. Of course, there's a lot of slang that I had to pick up like really quickly. You know, I got thrown into some like very very Mexican circles, and then it's just like the slang is just like being thrown around. That took me a while, and then also just like the fatigue of, you know, even though you can speak a language, but there's like a stage that you're in where it's like you speak the language, but if you're around it too much, it's like mentally taxing, and you can feel it, you know. And I went through that a lot when I first came here. I just felt tired. I was like, I miss speaking English with English speakers, because I spoke English at my job all the time because I teach my classes in English, but speaking English with someone who actually speaks English back is a totally different experience. So I think that was one of the biggest things to adjust to, and definitely like I would say the culture was, there's definitely differences, you know, to how things are in from where I come from, you know, and adjusting to those. But I would say within the first few months, I started getting used to it, and after like I would say 6 months, I felt pretty like comfortable here. Like I feel like I knew more or less what certain social cues were, and you know, I understood a lot more slang, or just not even slang, but like expressions that people use, or like, you know, when someone says something but they actually mean another thing. So I think that after about 6 months, I more or less felt comfortable. Obviously, I don't want to say I'm not going to come out here and say I'm an expert on Mexican culture, but like in terms of how I feel, I felt comfortable being here after about 6 months.
And you say you got thrown into the deep end with Mexican circles, and I suppose it was because of your relationship.
Yeah.
When you say that, do you mean that you had no English speakers around you at all?
Let me think about this. So I do remember that distinctly, having that thought, like I wish I was around more English speakers. So yeah, I was at so you know, I come here, I start my job, I spend a lot of time at work. There's 2 other English speakers at school, or at my school, who are English teachers, and they're British. So at least that's something. But you know, the whole American foundation is not there. There were 2 students who grew up in the States, so I had that. But you know, I'm not like spending a lot of time with them. You know, I teach in a class and they talk a little bit, and that's it. And then yeah, a lot of my circle when I first came here was based on, you know, my ex, because, you know, yeah, like I didn't know anybody here. I just come here and she already knows people, and so it naturally, that's kind of where it, you know, it leads to. Yeah, I remember there was a certain point where I was just like, I miss talking with other Americans, and so I went on Facebook and I was like, where are the Americans? And yeah, I remember, I don't remember when this was, but I do remember like there's in this Facebook group like trying to like just meet some other Americans, and we went out and had some drinks, and it was just kind of nice. Yeah. Okay. And then, so I work at the Colegio Suizo, the Swiss School of Mexico. And there's obviously there's a lot of Swiss teachers there. And I just remember I would, you know, be around them a lot, and they would be speaking, you know, Swiss German to each other, and like you could see like the tone changes when you're speaking your native language with people who also speak it, and I was like, I kind of miss that, you know. Yeah.
By the time we met, where were you with your desire to meet Americans?
I don't remember, honestly. I do remember I was nice. I was like, oh, like, well, I remember my first impression, we started speaking in Spanish, and I was like, oh, wow, she speaks, like, because I couldn't pin it on, I was like, is she Mexican or Latina? I couldn't tell, but I was like, she speaks Spanish really well. and then, you know, I found out that you're, you know, Mexican. I was like, oh, okay, that's cheating. That's why she speaks so well. But I think at that point in my journey, I was kind of like, I feel like I was kind of over that. I think what happened was, I kind of got over that. I don't know, I'm not going to say that it's a phase always. You know, I think there's a genuine desire for that sometimes, but at least for me, it felt kind of more like a phase. As I started to get more, like, I don't know where this happened, but at some point I got, you know, to a point where I'm like, if it's in Spanish or English, I really don't care. Like, it's fine either way. Unless it's like, you know, with really heavy accents or whatever, I don't know. Or surrounded by Spanish like all the time. That's the thing. But like I got I got to a point where I felt like I was fine in Spanish. I didn't really need that. And I think I also got to a point in my life and my journey here where I was like, what matters more is like the connection you have with that person. I think those two went in tandem, you know, being able to have deeper conversations in Spanish. And like, you know, I'd rather have a meaningful connection, much rather have a meaningful connection in Spanish than to have more surface level connections in English, if that makes sense. Not to say that, like, you know, small talk isn't valuable, but like, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Well, it's like if you're just looking for people to speak English with, then you're probably just going to end up talking about the weather because you haven't really connected with that person to connect with them. Whereas pushing through a little bit with the Spanish, that can be a more meaningful connection regardless of language.
Exactly, yeah.
I just remember when we met, I'm going to be super honest, and I hope
Please,
this is like super, like, not politically incorrect, I hope. But I was just so happy to see another Asian person. I was like twiddling my thumbs, like, when should I ask him where he's from? When is it okay to ask where he's from? And I was just like following everyone's cues because people in the apartment already knew you, and I kind of like figured out why you were there and like how we all knew each other. And you started speaking in Spanish, and I was like, oh, yo, his Spanish is so good. And I'm like, okay, now I want to know more. But like, I had to wait for a little longer in the dinner to be like, so tell me about yourself, Tim. And when you told me you were from, you'd gone to UMD, University of Maryland, and of course I grew up in DC. So I was like all that pent up DC energy that I didn't know I had came out, you know, because I haven't lived in the US for so long. I haven't been back to DC in so long that almost the way I speak in English has also changed.
Yeah, totally.
I speak a cleaner English because I know that everybody else has this standard world English. But I know that when I remember one time I went back to DC, it was about 2015, I think, somewhere around there. And I met some friends from high school, from middle school and high school, just did a get together. And I saw I heard myself change my English. I'm like, I'm such a poser.
No, I mean, like, I think we would, if we had met in the States, the way that this conversation would be unrolling would sound totally different. Not like drastically different, like, but I know what you mean, you know, it changes. And I think a lot of it is based on familiarity and comfort levels. Like, there are words that I would use if other people around me were using them, but they just don't come into my mind because I don't hear them. Or they pop into my mind in like the most random moments. But yeah, as someone who's been living, you know, outside of the States for a while, I can definitely tell, you know, my English has changed. And yeah, I you know, you mentioned that like, you felt like a poser, but you know, I think that's just natural. It's just what happens, you know. I think there's a certain level where maybe it can be disingenuous, but I think it's just a natural thing. But going back to what you said about when we first met, yeah, I think it's funny because, you know, I felt the same. I was like, oh, another Asian, but I was like, wait, is she? I don't know if she was like she full Asian. I don't know, but like she's Asian. But yeah, I think the funny thing is, you know, you're like, oh, I have to wait, you know, like, oh, social cues. But the way I've always seen this is like, you know, if someone who's not Asian comes up to me and asks me where I'm from, most of the time I don't get offended. You know, there's certain situations where I'm just kind of like, hi, my name is, or like instead of like that. But most of the time I don't get offended because it's just genuine curiosity, or they just want to make conversation. But when it comes to another Asian person asking me, I'm like, okay, you get a free pass. Like, you can just ask me now. Like, I don't know if you've ever had that kind of thought or feeling, but like, if another Asian person's asking me, free pass. Like, just ask me. Like I get what you mean. Like where are you from? Like, okay, I think I know what you mean.
I get the same feeling when I'm walking down the street and I'll see like another Asian person. Like I've seen like some Japanese tourists in Queretaro, and I'm like, I know you're Japanese, but like I want to know what you're doing here, and my eyes just won't go away, and I'm like, I need to leave these people alone. They're on vacation, and. Yeah, no, I mean, I understand the free pass thing because I have the same, like, there's a lot of people who want to know where I come from or what my background is. Is she Mexican? Is she Asian? And they're very curious. But I guess maybe it's the age. With the passage of time, I sort of don't like to answer this question anymore.
Okay.
I don't find it offensive. I just find it invasive now.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, I was happy to answer this question when I was in grade school because, kids, we like to jibber jabber about whatever. But now I'm an adult and I'm like, I don't know you. Like, to me, it's akin to somebody asking like, well, what does your family do? And I'm like, I've met you for 5 minutes. Like, we're not there yet. And it's not something I take personally, but it's just, and if somebody asks me, I will, by all means, answer politely because I do understand it's genuine curiosity. But if we're talking about how I genuinely feel in that moment, like if it's about how I feel as the person answering the question, I'm like, I could do without these questions. But I don't want to be rude either. So maybe that's my Asianness. I'm like, I don't want to be rude. I don't want to dishonor.
Nah, totally. I had someone today, I went through the fruteria, and like this mom and her daughter were there, and when I got there, they kind of were like, Buenas tardes, and I was like, Buenas tardes, which is typical pleasantries in Mexico. But then they were kind of looking at me, and after I was like, as I was getting ready to check out, they kind of come up to me and be like, ¿De dónde eres? Where are you from? So it happens a lot. And as I mentioned, most of the time, I think it just comes from genuine curiosity. Where I live, I haven't. Actually, no, the funny thing is, I haven't seen any other Asians in my neighborhood, except my next door neighbor is also Asian. So that's funny, but I haven't seen any others. And so, like, in a lot of places that we go here, I go here, I'm not that common of a sight. So I get that out. But I think it's interesting the way you put it as invasive. I think that that sounds a bit strong, but I think it describes it fairly well. For me, the way I tend to describe it is it's just tiring. It's just like, again. And it's like, when people ask me this, I like try to like, make conversation like, oh, where are you from? And like, normally, I mean, I always like from Mexico. And I'm like, but where? Like, what part of Mexico? But like, I don't know. Maybe this is me reading into it too much, but like, whenever that happens, it just doesn't go anywhere. It's like they just wanted their question answered and they don't want to talk anymore. And I think that's what feels tiring for me, that people don't really actually want to make conversation. They just see someone different and they're like, I want to know, and then that's it, I don't know if that's if you felt the same way.
I think that's why I use the word invasive, because it is just a question that they want answered rather than try to make a genuine connection. But at the same time, as strong as the word sounds, I wouldn't treat them like they were being invasive, right? Because I do see when we're in a society where most people are, not so diverse, looking Asian kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, or being black sticks out like a sore thumb, being slightly different sticks out like a sore thumb. Even a girl with blonde and blue eyes will stick out like a sore thumb, right? So I see that as just kind of like, price is a strong word, but like they're just the price of being different in a country that you're visiting. It comes with the territory, and that's fine. I hope I'm on a good day and I make some conversation and I chat and all of that. But personally speaking, if I could just choose my reality and make it, all about my feelings, I'd be like, I could do without it. But otherwise, I feel like I also don't want to make them feel bad for asking, because there, besides all this like background and where do you come from, what's your ethnic background, de donde eres, all these questions, I'm like, I don't think that curiosity should be, punished in that regard. And usually they're just curious. It's fine.
On that note, I don't know if you've experienced this too, but I think sometimes what comes to mind is like this thought of you might be the only Asian person that they have a conversation with this entire year, or certain people their entire life. And I think maybe embedded under that is a little bit of honor culture, like we must uphold the honor of our people. But I felt kind of this pressure to like, I don't want to let them down. I want them to leave with a good impression. And I think part of it is also just very, very genuine, because a lot of my experiences with people who have been positive with regard to me being Asian. But of course, most people who have been a minority in a place that is not where they're not the majority have had at least a couple negative experiences. And some of those negative experiences come from just the media, but I know that some of those negative experiences come from actual encounters with people. And so like keeping that in mind, being able to hopefully leave a good impression, or just even like for me, just leaving them with the impression that I'm a human too, I think can be really valuable, because I think that's one of the things that is just lost on people when you don't have regular contact with that, I don't want to say, I guess, type of person. You just see them on the TV or in the news. You kind of forget that they're people, and being able to have a genuine, polite, and pleasant conversation or encounter with someone, and just reminding you that you're both people, I think is a really genuine thing. But on that note, also, I do think that there are some, I felt this pressure that maybe I didn't need to feel to be able to leave that, good impression for the good of all the future Asians that they encounter,
Yeah, when you frame it like that, like it's like, the honor of my family, my people, my race, oh my God. Yeah, it's a stress. I think, and I agree with you. It does like, it does land that way sometimes, but I think like you said, like one day you just stop caring. One day you just stop thinking about it that way. And for me, like, for a long time, I thought that it was my job and my responsibility to represent Mongolian people to all the Mexican people because I am half and half. And then I realized, I was like, number one, where did I get that idea? Number two, that is a tremendous amount of pressure. And it's just like, I found a lot of solace in simplifying the matter and just saying, okay, how about just be a decent human being, and however they read that is however they read that. Because I think one thing that stressed me out a lot growing up in between cultures and yada 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 was if I was disappointing some group of people by behaving a certain way. And honestly, I think my adolescence would have been so much more simplified if I didn't think about it that way. But with all that said, discomfort, I think, made us think ever so deeply. Right?
Where do you think you got that idea from? That it's like it was your job to represent Mongolian culture to the Mexican people.
I think I got that from the Asian side of my family, of course. I don't think it was on purpose. Like, I'm quite critical of that part of my life, I think. But that's also how I felt. I also try to be careful in like what my family's intention was. And I think my family's intention was not to make me feel bad. I think my family's intention was, okay, we have our first mixed child in this family. A lot of our family members are now leaving Mongolia and going to the US or going to Europe or some European country to live. And what's going to happen to our family? What's going to happen to our tradition? What's going to happen? I think a lot of these anxieties begin to pop up in a family when that happens. And I think that in their attempt to instill cultural pride in me, and not cultural pride to be like all gung-ho about stuff, no pun intended, oh my god, but just to be proud of my heritage and where I come from, because now being mixed race, I understood that it is, I always thought it was not a political matter, because for me it was a very personal matter, but being mixed race, I realized was a really political matter, because what other evidence can you have of your culture? Oh shit, there's no easy way to put it. In the deepest anxieties of people who want to preserve their culture is the fear of their culture and tradition being watered down. And what stronger evidence of that do you have than a mixed race child who can't speak your language? So I think that I represented a lot of those anxieties in my family. And ever since I was little, I had this tremendous pressure, or I felt this tremendous pressure that I could not yet articulate, that I had to somehow be the best Mongolian I could be, because I had a lot to compensate for already. So that's sort of what that became in my adolescence, because I grew up in the United States. So you got all of that mixed up. And then I realized going back to that point of like, oh, I might be the only Mongolian person they meet, even if I'm half, or I might be the only Mexican they meet, even if I'm half. I'm like, I have to put on a good face. I have to like honor everything. And then one day I was like, it's like carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I was like, you know what? F this. And I dropped all of it in one day. And I was like, I'm still very proud of being where I'm from and my language and my culture. And and as a silver lining, thanks to this pressure, I do speak the language, right? And I'm very grateful for that. So there were a lot of good things that came out of that. But I was like, you know what? I think I need to find that balance between not feeling all that pressure, not needing to overcompensate, and still be able to, carry the totem pole to the store clerk who just wants to know where I'm from.
Also cool.
That was a very long answer. I hope that makes sense.
No, I mean, it makes perfect sense. I think you articulated it very well. It's clear that, you've really processed, or started at least processing all that weight that you were carrying around as a child and as an adolescent. But yeah, thank you. That's a very insightful answer. You mentioned that, you felt like you were carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. And that's an expression, but, in a way you were carrying the weight and expectations of an entire country, or two countries, maybe three countries on your shoulders. And that's can I swear?
Yeah.
Okay. Now that I've asked that question, it sounds weird if I actually swear, so I'm just going to save that in my pocket for later. But that's a lot to carry on your shoulders, especially as a young child and a teenager. But going back to a point that I had wanted to make earlier about something you said, like understanding that people are going to take things the way that they take them. Like you have no control, or, you don't have full control over how they're going to interpret things, or interpret you, or interpret whatever it is. And I think, realizing that it's not your responsibility to, be the perfect Mongolian, be the perfect Mexican, be the perfect Chinese American, whatever it is, to be that ambassador for your people. I think that's a very liberating feeling.
So I'm going to turn it back on you now. So your background is Chinese,
yes,
right? And you were born and raised in the U.S., is that right?
Uh-huh.
All the way that we see our Asian heritage and our Asian culture, like how do you understand it, having been born and raised in the U.S.? Because imagine your parents were not born and raised in the U.S., or were they? They were. Okay, so that means you're second generation?
Yeah, depending on your definition, but yeah, second. Some people use second, some people use third to describe what I am, but the short answer is my grandparents are from China.
Okay.
So yeah, that adds another layer to it. In a lot of ways, growing up, I actually felt like I was mixed, mixed Chinese with something else. You just broadly say American, because as I mentioned, my parents were born in the States as well, and I grew up in like the Chinese community that I grew up in, not saying like everyone around me was Chinese, but the community of Chinese people that I grew up in was almost all the parents were from China. So like I was kind of like a generation, quote unquote, ahead of them. And so like I was surrounded by it, but it wasn't my experience. It wasn't my story. And so actually I met a decent amount of people who were like half Asian, half something else, mostly white. And I actually identified a lot to them. Going to language, because language is not something that I really had control over. My parents both speak Chinese to varying degrees. However, they're still, their first language is English. And also the families, their families they speak two different dialects. So my dad's family grew up speaking Mandarin, and my mom's family grew up speaking a dialect called Toisan, which is similar to Cantonese. Okay. And so my parents could only communicate in English. So growing up, there was English in the house. In the beginning, they tried to speak their dialect with us and then English to each other, but it got really messy, especially once, there was 3 of us, and then there's 4 of us in total. It got really confusing, and they left it, which I, wish they hadn't, but, when you have 4 kids and you're doing all these other things, I can understand. It's something that I guess I wouldn't say I regret, because I didn't choose to stop, but it's something that I would have liked to have been given that gift, because I think, the language is a gift that you can give to your children. And so I was disconnected in that sense as well, whereas most of my friends grew up speaking Chinese with their parents, whether it be Mandarin or Cantonese or whatever. I I knew some Chinese as a kid, but I didn't really start studying Chinese until I got to high school. And even in high school, I didn't really treat it that seriously. I would say the turning point for me of actually wanting to really study Chinese was after I graduated. I went to Spain for a year, and I met Chinese people there, and they expected me to speak Chinese with them, and I had to be like, my Chinese is not very good. We had to speak in Spanish, and it was like that experience. Like, I don't know and in a way it was like, even though I didn't fully identify culturally with them, they did represent a slice of home, and me not being able to fully integrate with them made me like, okay, I really want to learn Chinese, or to really focus on being able to speak Chinese, because Chinese people are everywhere, and I can go to almost any country in the world and find other Chinese people, but if I can't speak Chinese to them, there's a limit to how much I can connect with them. So that's when I actually really started kind of on my own. I decided, okay, I'm gonna take Chinese lessons. I'm gonna focus more on this. I'm not going to learn any other new languages until my benchmark is, once my Chinese is basically as good as my Spanish, then I can learn another language. But until then, I'm not going to learn any more languages, because I want my Chinese to be at a point where I can, have meaningful conversations in Chinese. And I think part of that desire is like, I would like to have kids one day, and I would like to be able at least to give them that gift of speaking Chinese, even though it would be, a few generations down from the last person who was a native Chinese speaker. Even though it feels a little bit disconnected, I think it's still one way for me to kind of, connect with my culture. And I remember the first time that I went to China, or the only time that I went to China, I was just sitting there and I was thinking about how 90% of all of the people in my family tree called this place home, and only like a small percentage, I don't know, I didn't do the math on this, but a small percentage, I know, the math teacher didn't do the math, oops, but only a small percentage didn't know this as home. And in a way, even though that doesn't change my knowledge of Chinese culture, doesn't change my personality or the way that I act, but it did shift the way that I thought about it. I was like, this is still, in a lot of ways, mine, you know, and I can choose to claim it or not. Did that answer the questions?
Yeah. I'm just letting that marinate a bit because everything you just said, like, I feel it so hard.
Yeah.
Just that disconnect that you described, and just going back and visiting and being like, understanding that there's such a space, there's a gap between you and quote unquote your people, as bad as that sounds, you know, there's that space in between you, and you're very much, you're not, but you are, and that's the story of my life. I am, but I'm not, right? So I'm curious to hear more about your trip to China. Like, what city did you go to?
So I went to a city called Yangshuo. They don't have any relatives there, and so that's the thing. Like, I'm also very disconnected in that way. Like, almost all my relatives are in the States now, or they moved to the States. Very little family, and the family that we do have, we don't talk to them, or a little bit, you know, distant or whatever it is. So I was just like, okay, I'm gonna go to China because I've never been, but, you know, ethnically I'm Chinese, and it's be a good way for me to practice my Chinese, and I love traveling too, so like, shit, like, let's go. I went there for a summer. It was beautiful. It's there, they have like on the river, they have what is called like these karst mountains. It's like it's like, not like when we think about a mountain, you know, you think about this really, really big thing. Like the karst mountains are kind of like just giant or big rock formations. They just stick up. I don't know if you are imagining it right now, like this curvy river with like storks or whatever, and then like, they're not storks, they're, what are they called? There's some river birds, I forget, cormorants, and then there's these big rocks just jutting out with like green patches on the sides. I don't know if that it might remind some people of like Vietnam or whatever, because it's in Southeast China. That was a really long introduction for where I went, but anyways, I went there. Beautiful countryside. I went there for summer to teach English, and yeah, I like, as you mentioned, you go there and it's glaringly obvious that in a way you don't belong, you know, as soon as, and even the way I dressed, you know, gave some hints, but as soon as you open your mouth, they can tell that you have an accent, and they're like, okay, you're not from here. But until you open your mouth, you just kind of blend in. And that was really special for me, on a side note, because even though where I grew up there was a decent amount of Asians, you're never in a place where it's just, well, okay, but it's a different experience. Like, everywhere you go, everyone looks like you. And that was the first time I ever felt that. And I was just like, wow, wow, like, this is so weird. But yeah, I definitely, you know, there was the language that, you know, my Chinese got a lot better after that, but it's still nowhere near where I would want it to be. I remember, you know, I went with, and there was a bunch of other kind of, you know, expats, people from other places, and in certain situations, I would kind of be the de facto, like, okay, you know more Chinese than us. But then there was this one white guy from California who had spent a sizable amount of time in China, and he spoke really good Mandarin. And so it was like, we would go out, and, you know, the Chinese people would see us and they would look at me, but then this guy comes out and he starts speaking perfect Mandarin, and I'm just like, I'll let you take that. And in a way, it's almost humiliating, if depending on how, you know, I guess, self-confident you are and how prideful you are in those kinds of things. But it was definitely kind of like, that kind of hurts, you know. Yeah, so there was a lot of that. But as I mentioned, you know, there was that kind of just realization. At the same time as all of that was going on, all that static, there was that realization that, like, this is you, and you can claim that, you know. And one thing that I really enjoyed about being in Yangshuo was it's pretty. There's still pretty rural areas around that place, where you see people living almost the way that they've been living for hundreds of years, and it's like, I sit there and I think, this is probably how my ancestors lived, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents. This is probably how they lived, and just seeing that in front of me and being able to experience that, interact with that, was a cool experience. And so it's been a plan ever since I came back that I'm gonna go there and teach English or do something, work there for a year and just explore that more. I think I've got a lot more lessons I could learn. I think I've got a lot more Chinese food I can eat, a lot more recipes I could learn, people to meet, things to see. There's just so much diversity in the things you can do and see in China, that I would love to just, connect a little bit more with that. So that's been something that's been very present on my mind, even though, I've been here in Mexico. It's still very present. It's like that's gonna be my future, because I guess the way that I would describe it is, a lot of my cultural journey wasn't really given to me. I had to go and find it, and I don't think that so I have 3 siblings, and we've all kind of chosen our own different ways of interacting with our cultural identity, and I don't think that one is necessarily better than the other, but I think that for me the opportunity is there, and I want to take it and run with it, see what happens. So that's a long answer.
You have kind of you've had to find your way back to your Chinese background on your own, right? And that your siblings did it in their own way as well, or are doing it in their own way. Why do you think that we come to the United States, to a European country, and to the quote unquote West, where our parents clearly wanted to immigrate to give us better opportunities, and then we kind of pine our way back?
And I think, to a complicated question, there's always a complicated answer. So I'd say one of the things is, a lot of times grass is just greener on the other side. Like, I get this a lot in Mexico. People are like, you're from the States, why would you come here? And I get that a lot. And I think sometimes, you want to try something different. I think culturally, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think one thing that we touched upon earlier was a lack of belonging. You don't feel like you belong anywhere, so you don't feel like you're American enough, but you don't feel like you're Asian enough, and so sometimes maybe you decide to become more quote unquote American so that you feel like you belong more, and then I think on my case, I didn't feel like I belonged in an Asian space. Like, for example, when I went to Spain, I think that insecurity, that fear of not belonging, I'm not gonna lie, I think it is a motivator there. I don't want to comment necessarily on whether that's all good or all bad, but I think it's there. I think a lot of it also comes down to curiosity. I think because anytime you leave a culture, you physically leave a country and your culture, there's just gonna be stuff that is there, but it doesn't come up. And then I think also just growing up and delving more into what parts of me have been influenced from Chinese culture and what parts of me have been influenced from the American culture. Just growing up and becoming more self-aware and more just being able to process things, it made me more curious about, okay, well, what parts actually did come from that? And then, why is it like that? And I started, getting into Chinese history and stuff, and you actually Chinese people tend to be like this stereotype. Okay, or you can just leave it there. Or you can be like, but why? Okay, and then this historical event and this other cultural aspect that feeds into that. Oh, well, where did that one come from, and how does that play into it? And I think there's just so much to explore there.
It's a very complex topic. I think it's very complex, and 90% of people that might listen to this will have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's one of these very unique experiences that one can only relate to if you've been through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this isn't necessarily to ostracize anybody. It's just also the reality of the situation.
Yeah. There's one more thing I did want to add on. I think, me having lived outside of the States, where I lived in the States, you don't need to speak Chinese. It doesn't really help you. And not that speaking Chinese in Mexico helps you that much more, but you feel comfortable, you don't feel so different, I guess. At least where I used to live in the States, in Maryland and DC, there's a lot of Asians. I didn't know there were so many Mongolians in Northern Virginia, but
represent.
Yeah, but yeah, I guess all of that to say, I think one of the big motivators for me, I know that maybe wasn't that concise, but for me, one of the big motivators was being in Spain and in Mexico, looking different is how people give you your identity, if that makes sense. I always tell people, I'm American, I'm Chinese American. I always tell them first, I'm American, but in their eyes, you're Chinese, okay? Even if I wasn't Chinese, if I was Korean or Mongolian, they'd be like, you're Chinese, And so having, been through those experiences, I think that kind of, it pokes at something in you that's like, you're different, you're different, you're different. You're Chinese, you're Asian, you're Chinese, you're Asian, that's what you are. And I think that, I think that plays a role in it. It's like you're more reminded of it. I think when I lived in the States, yes, I was Asian, but I was around a lot of other Asians, and we were just there. We lived in America. It was fine. No one really pointed it out that much. But here, it's glaringly obvious that you are something else. And when I don't feel that much like that's something else that everyone thinks that I am, there's this gap, this disconnect,
Yeah. The identity that people assign you is something else entirely. Exactly. Because then you have to reconcile all your ideas about yourself with the ideas that the outside world has of you. And when you live in a very cosmopolitan city or country or area or whatever, in a more diverse place Northern Virginia and the DMV area, where there's just so many Asians. It's not even something that people think about, but yeah, I didn't think about how you being here in Mexico, you're the only probably Chinese person they've seen for miles. Yeah. And for kilometers, sorry. And and then it's like you introduce yourself as, hey, I'm Tim, I'm American. And they're like, no, you're not. Yeah. This kind of like, oh, really? Are you?
So many times.
Yeah. And yeah. Oh man, I have to sit on that for a second, because I could see how that could be a motivator for you, because you're like, well, everybody else is telling me I'm Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's funny, as you mentioned, I've literally had people say to me, they ask me where I'm from. I'm like, I'm from America. They're like, no, you're not. I'm like, bruh, what do you mean? I just told you. But yeah, I think it's there. I don't think it's something that anyone should build their identity on. I think, everyone should choose the path that they want to, form their identity. But I'm not going to deny that it doesn't have an effect. And I think even if you live in the most homogenous community in the world, you still have people telling you who you are in indirect or direct ways, and you have to figure out whether or not that's something that you're going to accept. Because there are things about your identity that you can't change, but there are also things that I think you can change. But no, there's no guidebook about which ones you can, which ones you can't, which ones you can't develop, which ones you can't expand, which ones you can't even add, you know? Like I would say that, you know, jokingly, I like to tell people that I'm Mexican, especially when they ask me where I'm from. I'm like, it's like Queretaro. But like jokingly, I do say like, you know, I'm Mexican, but there's always going to be a part of me that has a special place in my heart for Mexico, just because of what I've experienced here, what I've lived here, and that doesn't, I don't need to put a label on it. I don't need to say like, oh, I'm 1/16 Mexican, but that has an impact on my identity. And yeah, like that's something that I just added, you know. It wasn't even really a seed there. And maybe you could say there's a seed for every single culture out there. You just need to go cultivate it, but there wasn't a seed. I added that to my identity, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about identity. You'll never finish it until you die, and you're always in a process of discovering what you can and can't do, what you can change, what you can't change, what, you know, what's there because people told you that's what you are, and what's there because you actually are that, or yeah, it's a never-ending adventure.
Okay, so in every episode, I try to have like a small Spanish-speaking segment, simply because we are in Mexico, and I want to make sure that I don't completely alienate Spanish speakers. And the guests that I choose are normally people who speak quite proficient Spanish. So, ya me picaste la curiosidad con las conversaciones que tuviste con los taxistas. Cuéntame sobre una de esas conversaciones que tuviste con el taxista que quieras compartir con nosotros.
No me acuerdo bien de como una experiencia en particular, pero lo que te puedo decir es como en general, he conocido muchas personas de muchas partes de México, como muchas veces pues los taxistas, los conductores de Uber o lo que sea, no son de aquí de Querétaro, así que he tenido la oportunidad de platicar con ellos. No pongas esta parte en el podcast, pero una de las primeras cosas que me dicen es que la comida de tal lugar es mucho mejor que la comida de Querétaro. Querétaro no tiene nada de gastronomía. Siempre cuando hablo con otras personas, bueno, gente de otras partes de México, pues, me dicen, pues tienes que probar esto, es mucho mejor que la comida de Querétaro.
Tengo ganas de poner eso en el podcast porque yo también tengo la misma experiencia. Tuve un taxista de, pues, chilango, pues, que se vino a vivir acá hace unos 10 años. Y yo le dije, bueno, ¿y qué opinas de la gastronomía de Querétaro? Y me dice, ¿cuál gastronomía?
Bueno, si quieres lo puedes poner en el podcast, pero para mis queridos queretanos, yo no estoy diciendo nada, yo solamente estoy reportando lo que me dicen los taxistas. Pero bueno, sí, es algo chido que en las, pues, rides puedo aprender de otras partes de México. Incluso los de Querétaro, pues, tampoco encuentro muchos queretanos en Querétaro. Así que cuando, pues, conozco a un queretano, es como, wow, ¿eres de aquí? Pues explícame, enséñame, o sea, porque sí hay mucha buena comida aquí en Querétaro, pero los queretanos saben, los de que no son de aquí, sí saben, pero no saben los mejores lugares. Entonces, si es de Querétaro o si no es de Querétaro, pues, o sea, aprendo mucho de México. De, pues, lugares, de comida, de cultura, y sí, eso es algo padre de tomar un taxi. A veces, pues yo me subo y no quiero hablar, pero a veces sacamos la plática y eso sí está padre.
Sí, es cierto. Creo que las mejores conversaciones que he tenido con locals, I'm so Mexican, pues ha sido en los taxis. y he aprendido mucho de la historia de Querétaro y por qué vienen a Querétaro si es que no son de Querétaro. Yo aprendí de un taxista, pues del mismo taxista que dijo que no había gastronomía. Dijo que pues cada vez que hay un terremoto en la Ciudad de México se vienen para acá. Pero regresando al tema de la comida, ¿qué te gusta comer aquí en México? Queretano. Bueno, o queretano o mexicano.
Pues aquí en Querétaro, las mejores cosas que he probado, hay una barbacoa, bueno, hay un lugar de barbacoa muy rico cerca de a donde vivo. Entonces la barbacoa, sí me encanta. El mole, el mole, pues he comido mucho mole y siempre es mejor en la casa de una tía o una abuelita. No sé cómo lo hacen, creo que lo hacen con amor, pero, o sea, no sabe igual. O sea, también fui pues en Oaxaca y fui a unos restaurantes muy famosos para el mole oaxaqueño. Y, o sea, el mole de las tías es mejor. Entonces la barbacoa, el mole, ¿cómo es? Una comida de Yucatán, el relleno negro, no sé si lo has probado, súper rico. ¿Qué más? Barbacoa. Bueno, tacos de pastor, o sea.
Obvio.
Sí, obvio. Me encantan los tacos de pastor y pues podría comer muchísimos con piña. Y sí, creo que es esas tres cosas, la barbacoa, tacos de pastor y el mole. Y sí he probado muchas otras cosas en otras partes de México, unos chiles rellenos, unas sopas, pues, otras cosas. La gastronomía de México es muy, pues, o sea, hay mucha variedad, pero sí, es que en Querétaro no hay tanta variedad, creo. O sea, es como, lo bonito de México en general es que hay muchísima variedad, pero todo está lejos, ¿no? O sea, encuentras todo, pero tienes que manejarlo, tienes que tomar un avión. Entonces, o sea, para experimentar toda esa variedad tienes que moverte.
Quizás es por eso que la gente dice que la comida de Querétaro es de cierta forma, porque a lo mejor es eso lo que dices de la variedad. Yo no sé exactamente de qué hablan porque a mí me ha gustado todo lo que he probado aquí.
Sí,
a mi pareja también. Nosotros jamás nos hemos quejado de la comida porque todo está sabrosísimo. Y pues sí, hablas español como un mexicano. Entonces si le dices a alguien, hola, soy Tim, soy queretano, pues te creemos, te vamos a creer.
Gracias, eres muy amable. Bueno, yo hago mi mejor esfuerzo. Y pues sí, después de estar en México cierto tiempo, pues te mexicanizas. Algo así. Mi español ya es como mexicanizado.
Well, you said you learned Spanish from the books, right? And then you went to Spain?
Yeah. So I took 1 year of Spanish in college because I was curious. Spanish is probably the most popular language to take as a foreign language in school, but I didn't. But I was curious about it, and so I took 1 year, like 2 semesters of Spanish in the university. And then I went off to Catalunya, actually. So not the best place to learn Spanish, but I did end up learning Spanish. But of course, it's different from the Spanish here in Mexico. And so I definitely had to adapt. But the thing is, when I went, I was back in the States for 3 years, and by that time, if you go around speaking Spanish, like Castellano, from Spain, people are gonna be like, what? pretentious, like, or not pretentious, but like they're gonna be like, what do you like? What's wrong with you? 𝒌𝒂💐💏. And so like I worked in a school where there was a lot of the parents who were from Central America or Mexico, and so I would that was my training ground for Spanishizing. It's definitely a word. I'm an English teacher. Spanishizing my Spanish. And then at that point it was kind of more just neutral. And then when I started, talking with my Mexican ex-girlfriend, I started picking up a little bit more. And then once I got to Mexico, just like yeah, verga, ching, or you can cut that one out. No chingues, no mames, no te pases, no, yeah, you can cut that out.
You're gonna like, I can already see you walking down the streets of China, and you're gonna be like a Latina, a Mexican, where are you from? And you're just gonna be like in Spanish. I can see it. And
I thought about that. I was like, when I leave Latin America, I'm gonna miss speaking Spanish. And like if I go back to the States, I'll be plenty of people I can talk to. But when I go to China, I'm gonna be like radar. Like, my radar is gonna be on. Like I need speak Spanish. If I find like a Spanish speaker would be great, but if I find another Mexican, I'll be like, eso way.
Yes. I think on that lovely note, we're coming to the end of this episode. I want to thank you so much for your time, for your transparent telling of your story and of how your mind works when it comes to all of this. I can relate to a lot of it. I enjoyed hearing about it, and I'm very grateful to have had you here today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the hot pot. I thoroughly enjoyed coming on, and I felt like, it was very enjoyable to just chat and hear some of your experiences and bounce off of each other.
再见。
再见。